Why do so many people feel like exercise starts helping in midlife, until suddenly it doesn't? They're working hard, staying active, and yet they feel more fatigued, more sore, and more stuck than ever before. Welcome to the Aging Well podcast, where we explore the science, stories, and strategies that help us live longer, healthier, and more purposeful lives. I am your host, Dr. Jeff Armstrong, an exercise physiologist with a passion for making science simple and life better as we age, with my co-host, Corbin Bruton. In this episode, we explore a concept that's well known in athletic performance, but rarely discussed in everyday fitness: periodization. We're going to talk about what periodization is, why it becomes essential as we age, and how it can be applied practically to help us train in a way that supports longevity rather than undermines it. The Aging Well podcast encourages informed decision-making, and always consult your physician and scientific literature when making decisions about your health.
Dr. Armstrong, to start off today's episode, what is periodization in the context of exercise and training?
Well, periodization is basically just the systematic variation of the training program over the course of a period of time. Usually that period of time is like a year. It depends on the individual circumstances, what somebody might be training for. For the average individual, is pretty much just kind of an annual cycling of the training, so that we're hitting the various aspects of performance over the course of the year to optimize performance.
All right, well, let's talk more about that. Where did the concept of periodization originate, and why has it traditionally been associated with athletes rather than the general population?
Well, I think it originated for the purpose of athletes, and you're challenging me on the history here. My basic understanding, and I might be challenged on this if I'm wrong, but the basics of periodization really originated probably more in Soviet sports science, because they were far more advanced than the U.S. in regards to training methods, and a lot of the science evolved over there and made its way over here. And it took a while for periodization to really begin to evolve. And we also really started getting into more of sports performance training, kind of leading into probably more like the 1980s. So we were picking up on a lot of that science as, the Soviet Union opened up a little bit more to what they were doing science-wise. And then so this idea of periodization really gets its origins in sports and looking at primarily like Olympic athletes, or even collegiate athletes, where you look at, say, football having a in-season, post-season, off-season, pre-season cycling of training. And then it also has made its way into, you see it with Olympic lifting, that has moved into powerlifting and even into bodybuilding now in those areas. So it originated really with athletes, because the athletes were much more focused on performance. General population, we've kind of led people in the general population to exercise according to the American College of Sports Medicine guidelines, which to me are woefully limited. They're really designed for general health. And as we've categorized, in teaching over the years, I've always categorized fitness in two broad categories. You have the health-related components of physical fitness, and then the neuromotor-related, skill-related parameters of fitness. And so, on the health side, we have the cardiorespiratory, muscle strength, muscle endurance, body composition, and flexibility. Well, those all make sense. They're for health, and that's what most people are pushed to do. You got to worry about and heart health especially was the biggest focus in general fitness for decades. It's only been recently really where we're realizing, strength is important. We better be doing some strength training.
Right.
And the motor skill area, that was focused much more on athletes, because it was speed, power, balance, coordination, reaction time, and those types of things. And so we didn't tend to think of those as things that the average person, particularly the aging adult, needed to do. And thankfully, many are starting to push into that area a lot more. And so we're seeing that there is a need for, there's always been a need for, but we're seeing more of a need for cycling that training in older adults or aging adults.
I'm just trying to visualize this for the general population because I'm thinking like an athlete, and I recall in the off season of the sport training extremely hard. Like our coach would really push us in the off season to like get bigger, get stronger, get faster. And then once we entered into the season, it's kind of more about conditioning. And then as the season continued and we made ourselves into playoff, we almost had almost no like extra training, a little bit of conditioning here and there, but to prevent the injuries from happening in a critical time like playoffs, that it was few and far between because we had put so much training and energy into the off season that once we made it to playoffs, it was almost second nature. I'm just trying to visualize that for a general population point of view. Like, could you kind of summarize how that connection would be?
Well, I think you can't make that connection because you're dealing with different populations.
Gotcha.
The idea of periodization, and the reason, we label, preseason, off season, in season, all that kind of stuff is because that's what athletes are doing. Well, if you have somebody who's not competitive, they're not having an in season, postseason, preseason, off season, and all those types of things. And so it's probably more effective to label the cycling of periodization in regards to strength, hypertrophy, power, speed, those types of things. And so if you recall from physiology of exercise, the force velocity relationship, and it's kind of hard, on in an audio podcast to really demonstrate that. But, just think of at a lower velocity is where you're going to be lifting the most amount of weight the slowest. And then your fastest movement is going to be at a much lower force output. And that's your speed. And then as you get a little bit more force involved with it, it's more power. Then you move into more strength. And then pure strength is where, you're just moving as heavy a weight as possible. Speed is not the issue. And then that curve kind of hits the line at zero velocity as an isometric contraction. And then what a lot of plots don't look at is continuing that into the eccentric contraction, where then you have a negative velocity. And this is where I like to talk in terms of train between the asymptotes. Something I learned from Steve Swanson years ago with my affiliation with Athletic Republic is that we want to be training individuals so that we're working not only the capacity to move forces at a fast velocity, but also being able to receive heavier weights in an eccentric fashion. And I think oftentimes most training is going to be somewhere between about 60 to 120% of your voluntary maximal isometric contraction. And that really limits speed performance, and it also limits eccentric contraction performance. And for older adults structuring their programming, it's not about preseason, off-season, all that. It's about building hypertrophy. So we build muscle mass so that we can translate that into greater strength gains. And then those strength gains we can translate into being able to move faster, more powerfully, and then kind of cycle back into periods of hypertrophy. And so we get very structured with periodization because periodization is structured. And there's different approaches to doing it. And I don't think probably this podcast is really the necessary place to kind of go into the nuts and bolts of periodization, because, most of our viewers and listeners, if they're athletes, they're already understanding the whole process of, speed, power, strength, hypertrophy. But for the older adult, to just think about how we can vary the training systematically over a period of time to get the most gains out of it. You can look at it. There's basically linear periodization is where everything kind of increases linearly. You're kind of increasing intensity, decreasing volume, and vice versa. Or you can look at block, which is where we'd say, okay, this is a period of time I'm going to work on hypertrophy. Now I'm going to work on strength and so on. Or what I prefer really more is an undulating type of approach where you are going more microcycles. And when we talk periodization, we talk in terms of cycles. So it's periods of weeks generally that you're doing specific types of training. You might do strength, endurance and power all in 1 week, but you're varying it in cycles so that over time we're building all of those different aspects of strength and conditioning and everything else. Does that make some sense?
Yeah. Yeah, way more detailed than I wanted, but it was great. It was a perfect. I love that answer. Let me ask you this though. Why do you believe periodization is especially important for aging adults compared to younger individuals?
Well, I'm not sure that I would say it's any more important, but I think from an aging adult standpoint, we generally is once you get away from sports and you have younger individuals who are generally very active in sports, and so that cycling is going to come a little bit more naturally with their training, especially if they're training properly. And most athletes today are getting some level of training, whether it's good or adequate. It's sometimes a bit more debatable, but younger individuals are more naturally going to be going through cycles of periodization. You just, especially if they're doing multiple sports and if they're doing conditioning specific to their sport. But as we get out of sport and we're either just kind of going through the motions at the gym or we're not going to the gym at all. And we tend to then fall into that general fitness prescription of exercise where it's 8 to 10 exercises, 8 to 12 repetitions, 3 days a week, and very little variation from that. And so you go to the gym every day, and you might be going to a gym, a Planet Fitness or a LA Fitness, some of these gyms that are just kind of standard gyms and are mostly machines. You don't really know what you're doing, and you just start at one side and you go around the room. You do maybe enough to do leg exercises first, and you work large muscles to small muscles, but you do essentially the same exercises every time. You're not going to be seeing the gains that you can see if you cycle doing maybe different exercises, but also varying up the rep range, the intensity that you're doing, as well as varying up the speed of the movement. A lot of people don't even, they might do different reps, but they don't focus in on the speed of that movement. That's going to have an impact. And I think for older adults, we tend to, maybe we might maintain muscle mass a little bit more effectively, but we're still slowing down, or we're not building or maintaining enough strength that we can do more as we get older. And I think that's where it becomes especially important for older adults, is to kind of have that breadth of speciality in the exercise so that we're maintaining more of our physical capacity as we age.
I like that you mentioned speed. I it's like the older I get, the more I realize the importance of tempo and speed. And I can't believe I just overlooked it when I was younger. Because when I was younger, in my teens and in my 20s, I'd just go to the gym, I'd work out, and I would see results instantly. And now that I'm older, doing the same exercises, same routine, I don't see as quick as results, but I've noticed when I slow the tempo down, um, I get way more of a pump, and I can feel the difference. And then I don't know, I feel like my clothes are fitting differently, just by changing that tempo up. And I think it's a completely underrated, underestimated technique that it's so easy to adapt and to throw into your daily regimen. And a lot of people just kind of like, I just got to get through this. I just got to get this exercise done. But it goes back to what we've talked about in previous podcast episodes. When you train with a purpose, right? Train with a purpose,
Right.
have a goal set. So,
That's the whole point of
right.
periodization. And the whole tempo piece too is that, for years, and I was trained this way as I went through my early exercise physiology programs. It's like you do like a 2-second concentric contraction and then a 4-second eccentric contraction, which is fine for hypertrophy, but no sports movement or even just kind of trying to respond, say you trip over a line on the sidewalk and you got to kind of catch yourself. That requires a much more explosive movement. And so being able to maybe quickly do that concentric contraction, you can slow down the eccentric, maybe get a little bit more hypertrophy out of it while you're working more power. But even like going and allowing ourselves to drop into an eccentric a little bit faster and get that stretch reflex is going to have a benefit of us overall training. And so, yeah, we not only have to go slower, we also have to go faster in some of those tempos.
So speaking of training, what do you think happens psychologically when people train hard all the time without a structured variation or recovery?
Let's take a brief pause to recognize one of the affiliate partners that helps support the Aging Well podcast. We are not sponsored and we never accept paid placement. But when you use our affiliate links, it helps to keep the show going. One company I've personally vetted and trust is Jigsaw Health, particularly their high-quality magnesium and electrolyte products. They also offer the Root Cause Protocol packages developed by Morley Robbins, who joined us on an earlier episode of the podcast. I appreciate Jigsaw's transparency, testing, and thoughtful formulations, and I use the products myself. If you'd like to support the show and explore Jigsaw Health or the Root Cause Protocol for your own wellness journey, check out the link in the show notes. So, psychologically, if people are training hard all the time, it's really mentally draining. I mean, it's a stressor on us psychologically. And so if we're training hard all the time, we don't get that rest. We start to enjoy exercise less and less. And that emotional fatigue could cause us to not go to the gym as much. And we also might, because we're training too hard, we start to see less gains in the training. Because again, that's another point of periodization is, we want to be cycling between sometimes a maintenance phase where maintenance volume where we're just going to be maintaining what we're doing so we can build something else, or we're hitting that minimum effective volume to get some level of performance, but our body is kind of able to readapt to maybe a new exercise or to kind of build into an intensity or a volume of training. And so we want that structure in there to give us enough variety to make the exercise interesting so that we can maintain the exercise and, be a bit more consistent in terms of performing exercise, but not necessarily being consistent in what we are doing exercise-wise. And so that psychological piece is pretty important.
All right, same question, but instead of psychologically, what do you think happens physiologically when people train hard all the time without structured variation or recovery?
Well, in this case now, the body's just not able to adapt. It just keeps going through these cycles of really hard stimulus, but there's not adequate recovery. The muscle doesn't have the adequate time to be able to grow as much as it potentially can. And so a lot of training is really balancing the physiological stressors so that, we have enough stress to stimulate gain, but we are able to then recover from that through sleep, through nutrition, and so on. Although I would say that for most individuals, whether you're an athlete or not athlete, I think most individuals are more likely to not train hard enough than they are to train too hard. Or they train too hard, but not with the right structure and variation and recovery protocols in place. And so too hard is generally just a poor management of the exercise stimulus. There's nothing wrong with going hard all the time, but it's where are you going hard? What areas, what systems are you trying to stress? You're working hard on your cardiovascular, you're working hard on your muscles, are you working hard on is it leg day or is it arm day, chest day, whatever. You want to be going hard, but structuring that hardness in a way that other areas are still either getting their level of stimulus to be able to at least maintain or get a minimal amount of improvement, but they're recovering while something else is going hard. And so it's a hard equation, and I think this is where novice exercisers really should begin with some instruction from somebody who knows what the heck they're doing to kind of guide them in how to do what they're doing. And get that structured stimulus to the exercise, but then also be structured in your recovery so that you're working hard, you're burning calories, but you're doing it with purpose and following that principle of specificity, principle of overload, and certainly the principle of progression.
So, would an example of that be just plain and simple overtraining? Like, say you're doing your workout routine, you're doing your regiment, and then one day, what the weights that you grab, which were once like, I can do this, this is easy, just appear heavier, and you just feel like you're fatiguing more, and psychologically you're like, dude, I know I can do this, I just did it last week, or I did it the day before, why can't I do this? And then all of a sudden you take like 2 days off of rest, and then you go back to your workout routine, and you just hit all PRs, everything, your strength, your endurance, everything increases. Is that kind of an example of what we're talking about right now?
Well, I wouldn't call it overtraining. I'd be very careful not to call it overtraining. Overtraining is where you have pushed your physiological limits beyond the capacity to recover, and your body is not getting enough recovery time, not getting enough recovery modalities that are going to allow for recovery. And so the body begins to break down. You start to see decreases in performance. That one day decrease in performance might not necessarily be overtraining, particularly if you could take 2 days off and then immediately hit a couple PRs. That to me is what I would classify as more overreaching. And there is purpose in overreaching from time to time in our training. When we look at, and I like using the landmark volumes that come from How Much Should I Train? It's a book from Dr. Mike Israetel and I think it's James Hoffman, the authors, where you're training in that golden zone between the minimum effective volume and your maximum recoverable volume. So the minimum effective volume is a volume you need to do to be able to stimulate some level of adaptation. This is as opposed to your maintenance volume, which is a lower amount of exercise. That is what you minimally need to do to be able to maintain, but not necessarily gain any not necessarily. You're not going to gain anything performance-wise, because if you're going to gain, you're at your minimum effective volume, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Maximum recoverable volume is the most that we can do and come back for the next scheduled training session and be able to do what we intend to do.
Gotcha.
And if we go just beyond that, then you're going to find that probably that next training session, you're not quite hitting your full recovery. And if you continue down that route, you're going to overtrain. But typically what we do when we exceed that maximum recoverable volume, the whole point is then to have a planned deload where we drop off the exercise a bit more, go to a lighter load, maybe drop down to that maintenance volume, or we go down to kind of a new minimum effective volume, change the training, and then kind of do another cycle up where we start to build up more of the intensity, the duration, the volume of the training, and then do some more recovery. And that's all part of periodization too, is where we're cycling these levels of training over time. And even if that's all you do, you don't necessarily go through hypertrophy phases or strength phases and so on. You just simply ramp up and ramp down the intensity, the volumes of the training that you're doing. You're going to see better gains overall because your body is being stimulated in novel ways, and then the intensity is brought up, and then we give adequate recovery, and then we start it again. And so just simply cycling is something that the aging population could do, as opposed to, again, just going to the gym and lifting the same weights all the time, same exercises, and not seeing any kind of level of progression.
So, how does aging change our ability to tolerate stress and recover from exercise?
Yeah, that's something that I don't know that I can really answer that well, because I think the literature is mixed, and I don't think we've done good enough science on it. And I think for the most part, we tend to just buy into this belief that as we age, we have less tolerance for stress and exercise, and that we can't recover as well. And there may be some changes that go in there, but I think, it really depends on the individual. If you look at somebody who, is a power lifter and they're lifting significant amount of weight early in their career, they're in their 20s and they're deadlifting 1,000 pounds. If they continue to keep working at that level, eventually it becomes harder and harder for the body to recover from that. It's putting a lot of stress on the body. And that's not a matter of age. It's just a matter of wear and tear. If you buy a brand new car and you go out and drive it on the highway 200 miles an hour all the time, first of all, you're going to either kill yourself or kill somebody on the highway. But, you're pushing that car, and maybe you're not taking care of it enough. You're not tuning the engine. You're not, changing the oil. You're not doing all the things to give that car some rest and some maintenance. It's going to burn out, and we're not intended to go high performance all the time. And for athletes, something people don't understand when they talk about training like an athlete, athletes beat the crap out of their bodies to be able to perform at super physiological levels. I mean, they're beyond normal physiological performance. And that's the whole point of athletics, is to see how far we can push the human body in performance. But that takes a toll on the body. And so if you're doing that, eventually you're going to kind of get to a point where, if you continue to try and train that way, your body is not able to tolerate that stress. Now, for most older adults, the reason why they might see injuries or have more difficulty recovering from exercise is that they haven't conditioned themselves properly to progress that exercise, or they don't have the exercise tolerance yet to be able to do it. And so it's really a balance of how are we managing the stress load on the body that's stimulating the exercise, the adaptation, and allowing the body to recover. And in older adults, there's probably some likelihood where there's a little bit more intolerance to that stress and a little bit more difficulty recovering. Our cartilage tends to, age a bit. Our bones are aging. There's a lot more wear and tear on the system over the course of time. But if we're taking care of ourselves, we're eating well, we're getting adequate sleep, we're managing the exercise stimulus appropriately, there's not any real difficulty in terms of being able to tolerate that and recover from it. It's really managing how much we're pushing the body and how much we're recovering from that. If we don't allow recovery, yes, we're not going to be able to tolerate the stress. And we might need more sleep. We need better nutrition. And that's really where I think the problem comes in, is that older adults typically just don't allow themselves the level of recovery and, proper nutrition and all those types of things to be able to maintain the health of their joints and their body.
I agree with you. Especially in the part where, like, I don't know if we've hit all of the science exactly, or as you said, I don't know if we scienced good enough for that. Um, because the literature that's out there, it makes sense biologically. As we age, our ability to recover, there's some factors that hinder us. With that also being said, from personal experience, when I was personal training, there was a lot of individuals that were in that, third age bracket that we've talked about, going into that almost the fourth age bracket. They would really, really push themselves, and they were either surpassing the 20 or 30-year olds with the endurance and the strength, and they just loved it. It was like first thing in the morning, they get their exercise routine in, and it appeared, just on a visual portion, that it appeared that they were recovering faster in the workout. Now, it could have been the individuals themselves. It could have been just the fact that they've trained leading up to that. Some of them said they never had a background in training and they just wanted to try something new. They hit the age of 70 and they were like, you know what, this class sounds fun. And it was amazing to me how well they would recover, how well they would perform, how hard they would push themselves. And so, although there is that literature out there, I believe there's a whole realm that we don't fully understand or comprehend as we age, because we have a stigma saying, well, as we age, or the body breaks down. I also think that there's a way for the body to adapt and recover. I know that that may not make sense because the literature kind of contradicts it, but yeah, does that make sense what I'm saying? Like, I've witnessed firsthand.
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, part of that is the fact that people are new to exercise and their bodies are making adaptations. They're
Yeah.
going to adapt. And so, again, it's not a matter of age. And you mentioned, they're moving into fourth age. I would say if they're moving into fourth age, then they're not adapting that way to exercise, because the whole definition of, the fourth age is decline and decrepitude. And if people are training properly, whether they start early, starting late, the more fit we are, the better adaptation we're seeing in exercise, then the more likely is we progress through the third age, we're just going to hit a cliff and drop off of it at the end and die, as opposed to having a prolonged period of fourth age where, we're sick and, maybe spending time in a hospital, spending time in a nursing home, and those types of things. And so, part of the whole point of periodization too is to prepare the body throughout the third age to be able to live with vitality, be able to live with activity, and just kind of drop off at the end rather than, having this period of decline.
Many people equate consistency with doing the same workout repeatedly. So how would periodization challenge that mindset?
Well, it is entirely is the challenge to that mindset that, doing the same exercise or same workouts repeatedly, there's nothing to adapt to because you've already adapted to the stimulus, the novelty of that exercise. And so consistency isn't about doing the same thing over and over again. It's about exercising with a plan in place. And so consistency should involve a lack of consistency to be very effective, where you're not doing the same thing all the time. Now, the opposite of that, sometimes say, well, okay, if I don't want to be doing the same workout repeatedly, then I want to do something different every time I exercise. And that's not helpful either, because where the consistency comes in is as we periodize through, as we go through these cycles of training, whether it's a micro or macro cycle, you're increasing either the volume or the intensity over time. You're doing more work, lifting either more weight or doing more repetitions, doing more sets. Over time, you might be doing the same exercise, but because you're doing the same exercise, that consistency in doing that same exercise for that brief cycle period is going to allow you to develop both neurologically and physiologically to that stimulus. And so as you are lifting more, so you haven't squatted in a while, you start doing squats. The squats are going to be novel at first. You're going to see some neurological adaptation of that initially, and then the hypertrophy starts to kick in. And if we continue to lift that same movement over and over and over again, there's no new neurological adaptation to that. You're just simply maybe getting some hypertrophy. You're not changing the patterns that the brain is having to coordinate in order to protect or to progress that particular movement. And so if I do the same thing over and over again, my brain's not having to be stimulated to make any adaptation. The muscle is like, well, I don't need to put any more energy into growing this muscle because we're not putting more load on it. I don't have to worry about, next time you might come in and put 10 more pounds on. I got to be ready for that. And so consistency is necessary to a point to be able to get better adaptation over time. But then we still need to cycle that so that we're not kind of just numbing the body of the stimulus and not getting any adaptation. A lot of people, if they're kind of willy-nilly in their programming, you do a different exercise, you're never quite at the weight that you can tolerate to the greatest extent. And so you come in, you do, okay, today I'm going to do squats, and then the next day I'm going to do lunges, and then the next day I'm going to do leg press. And you're working the same muscles, but those muscles aren't going to be loaded to a capacity where they're going to see the greatest adaptation because you're not pushing them hard enough. Either that or you're pushing them too hard because you don't know how much load you should be doing. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Why consistency is important?
Would like a good example of adding or increasing the stimulus to allow the body to adapt easily? Would that just be, hey, once a week you just add those little tiny 2.5 pound plates? It doesn't seem like a lot, but over time you're just slowly increasing the weight over and over and over again. But it would be enough for the body to completely adapt because you're still adding that additional weight, but it doesn't seem like it at first. And eventually that weight's going to add up, and so you're increasing the stimulus. Would that be a good, easy, simple, like a completely simplified way to do it?
That is a way to do it. I wouldn't say it's the only way to do it. I mean, you can, if you look at the traditional 5x5 program,
right.
Smart Lift 5x5. You can start with a 45-pound barbell, even less, and add 5 pounds every workout. Eventually, if you added 5 pounds every workout, 3 workouts a week over the course of a year, you're going to be tremendously strong, and it's just not going to happen that way. And so we can't just rely on adding more weight. That's where changing the exercise periodically, adding, tempo changes in the exercise, adding more volume through more sets and things like that is going to have a greater benefit. If you're enjoying the Aging Well podcast, be sure to like, subscribe, or follow on your favorite platform so you will never miss an episode. And if you find our conversations helpful, please share the podcast with a friend, because aging is something we're all doing, and we're better at doing it together. And support our guests in this podcast financially by visiting the affiliate links in the episode description below, and use the links or codes provided for discounts on products we have vetted and feel comfortable recommending to our valued viewers and listeners. Thank you, and now back to the podcast.
Okay, Dr. Armstrong, can you explain the difference between training randomly and training with the intention over weeks, months, and years?
Well, I think I touched on that a little bit. And, when you look at just randomly training, there's no purpose involved. There's no structure. There's no intention. And if you go randomly, you don't have a destination in mind. And, kind of a way of looking at that is like if you just hop in your car and just start driving willy-nilly with no destination in mind, who knows where you're going to end up. And you might get to where you want to go, but then again, you might not. And so when we train with intention over months, weeks, years, whatever, we're more likely to get to the specific destination that we're after, because we're training specifically for that. And that's not age specific. You can start training with intention at any age. And if you want to, I honestly think if you are in your 80s and you want to bench 300 pounds, you have the capacity to do that if you train properly and with the right intention, with the right, nutrition, or right recovery and all that kind of stuff. And of course, have kind of the right body type to be able to do it. But, it's the point of intention is to have that goal. We talk about the principles of adaptation. You have overload, progression, specificity, reversibility, and recovery, in addition to individuality. And, the specificity piece is where that intention comes into play. The body's going to make specific adaptations to impose demands. And if I'm doing the same thing over and over again, I'm not really making any kind of stimulus for adaptation. The body's going to tend to, it's the same old stuff. So I'm just going to, maybe adapt enough to have a little bit more strength or a little bit more endurance or those types of things. But we're not going to see the level of gains that we can potentially see.
Well, how does periodization help reduce injury, risk, and chronic pain as we age?
I think this is probably one of the most important aspects of periodization for the aging population. So if we do buy into some of the notion that, and maybe this is the case, but if we buy into the notion that the body can't handle stress as much as we get older, the joints are more likely to be damaged, and, we have more risk of injury as we age, and it's all the more reason to do periodization. Because if my joints are going to be affected by the load that I put on it, well, I have two options. I can underload the muscle and not see any gains, or I can overload the muscle and I run the risk of overloading too much to where I cause injury. And in that situation, then I need to back off before I hit the injury and then allow the body to recover. And so when you're lifting heavy, and again, heavy is relative, but the stronger we get, the more that load is going to put stress on the joints and such. So if I'm lifting heavy all the time, then my body is going to begin to be overloaded to a point where it can get injured. But if I push it to that point where I'm going to stimulate some adaptation and I back off a little bit, my joints can heal. I'm doing maybe something else. I'm using the joints a little bit differently. I get adequate healing and recovery, and then I'm going to be able to come back. And so we reduce the risk of injury and chronic pain by reducing the risk of injury. I mean, that sounds kind of, answering it with the answer, with the question. But, if the risk of injury is because I'm lifting more than my body can handle, then I'm not pushing myself to that point of injury, but I'm pushing myself close enough that the body recognizes that we're on that cusp of injury, I need to adapt in order to prevent that injury from occurring in the future. And then, we push just to that limit. We get a little bit of adaptation. Now we've reduced that risk of injury. Whereas if we just totally avoid it, or we don't come near that threshold, the body has an innate ability to protect itself. It wants to protect itself, and it is generally going to overprotect itself. And so if, you think of like the Golgi tendon, and I'm getting a little bit anatomical and maybe a little bit too philosophical for some of, or not physiological for some of our listeners. The Golgi tendon is a receptor that's in the tendons of the muscle. Its point is to recognize tension in the tendon. And if that tension is too great, then it's going to tell the muscle that is contracting not to contract. It's going to say relax, because you're going to get hurt if you try and contract against this. And then it relaxes the opposing muscle. So we call those the agonist and the antagonist muscles. So if I were to have you stand with your arms flexed and ready to receive a weight, and I drop a 500-pound barbell in your hands, you're not going to be able to contract against that and even receive it and eccentrically lower that weight. Your muscles are immediately going to feel that excessive tension, and it's going to say, whoa, I got to protect myself. And it's going to just relax your biceps, and your triceps are going to contract to just get out of the way of that weight. That's how our body is protecting ourselves. But we tend to do that too early. And so if we push that just a little bit further, and this is where plyometrics come into play in terms of training, or doing depth jumps, or things where we are kind of eccentrically loading, we're going to get just enough adaptation. We just push it a little bit further, and then the body adapts to it. But if we avoid that completely, then we're going to run a much greater risk of injuring ourselves when that situation arises where, out of our own control, we're receiving too much force. Does that make sense?
No, it definitely does, and it really helped with you describing the that visual example. I think that will really help make the connection for even if it quote unquote didn't make sense to people. That description alone that really helped answer and make that connection with my brain, and I'm assuming with a lot of the listeners' brains as well. Now, my next question.
Let's pause for a moment to thank the affiliate partners who help support the Aging Well podcast. We're not sponsored, and no company pays for airtime here. But when you use our affiliate links, it helps us keep producing thoughtful, evidence-informed content. One brand I genuinely trust is Ora Wellness, especially their Glutarol, Glutarol Plus, and copper peptide formulations. I've spent time vetting their science, their ingredient quality, and their transparency, and I personally use these products in my own wellness routine. If you're interested in supporting the podcast and exploring tools that may help you feel and function better, check out Ora Wellness in the show notes.
What role does recovery play in periodization training, and why is recovery often underestimated in aging populations?
Honestly, I would probably make the argument that recovery is overestimated in aging populations and underestimated. And that's probably even in younger populations. I mean, across our training cycle, most people tend to be overall undertrained as opposed to overtrained. But, we don't think of recovery as much in the aging populations because, part it might be that we are so used to joint pain and all those types of things. We all think that's part of aging. And we don't think of it as a part of, I'm just not recovering well enough from my exercise. Or, if you wake up and you're tired, it's like, I'm just old and all that kind of stuff. It's not that, you're not eating right. You're not getting enough nutrition. Yeah, you maybe did too many sets of the exercise yesterday. So, maybe do a little bit different workout today. I think it's just something we don't focus on and tend to manipulate as much as we over or underestimate it. It's just something we don't pay enough attention to. And I think it is very important when it comes to periodization in order to make sure that we're optimizing our adaptation. And it's not a matter of, I think too often we look at recovery and say, well, I don't feel recovered enough, so I shouldn't do this or that today. And I believe much more in a planned periodization, planned recovery. And so knowing, okay, I'm going to struggle through this workout this week because I'm in the fourth week of a cycle and I have a deload coming up next week. I just got to push through it, do it to a point that I'm not going to hurt myself, but push through and then know that I need to back off a little bit the next week. Got to keep my nutrition up. I got to make sure that I'm getting to sleep on time and all those types of things. And recovery plays into, we talk about the importance of sleep. Whether you're exercising or not exercising, sleep is important. Nutrition is important. But how closely we focus in on those is a little bit more important as we look at training. And, we're not necessarily periodizing our sleep or our nutrition. We may periodize kind of caloric intake over the cycles of training, as we might look at going to a period where we're going to maybe try and lose a little bit of body fat and maintain muscle mass, maybe need a little bit more energy as we are working a little bit harder. And so, we may see a little bit of periodization when it comes to nutrition in some of our recovery periods. Maybe we get to bed earlier when we're training our hardest week, but it needs to be a component that everybody considers, whether you're training hard or not training hard. How are you recovering from that exercise? But don't think that as you get older, you need so much more recovery. The amount of recovery that we really need is relative to the training stimulus. The more weight I'm lifting and the more volume I'm doing in a workout, the more recovery I need. And again, that's always relative, because if I'm looking at relative to my maximum and my maximum recoverable volume, then I need more recovery. So 100-pound squat might be really challenging and overloading for one individual, but for another individual who's been training longer, that's like not even maintenance volume. And so we have to really look at what's our capacity, how are we progressing, and how well can we recover from that exercise. If we do an exercise or we do a workout and we're scheduled to do a workout 2 days later and we're just not feeling it, we're not pushing the same weights, then we have to look at, okay, well, what am I doing recovery-wise? Or am I doing too much of a load that I need to back off from it for a while?
It sounds to me, and maybe this is just a simplified version, it sounds to me that you're saying be aware that the body wants to and will adapt to anything that you throw at it. Maybe that's a simplified version of it, but it seems to me that what you're saying is be aware and recognize that our bodies will adapt and wants to adapt to whatever situation we're putting it in. And so if we're continuously giving it training, it will adapt and wants to adapt to that. Maybe that's just a simplified way of looking at it.
I want to underscore, though, that it can adapt to everything that we throw at it, so we have to be planned and systematic in what we throw at it. But the goal is to train in a way that will stimulate our body to make the adaptations necessary to kind of be, stronger, faster, better cardiovascular fitness, better performance, the next go around. And we can continue to progress. Yeah, that progression might not be as great and noticeable from week to week, month to month as we get older in our training or as our bodies are older, but we can make significant adaptations And the earlier we start, obviously the better. And the earlier we start and the more adaptations we made, maybe the more difficult it gets to get more and more adaptations as we get older, because, you look at some of these really strong, big athletes, they're not going to be able to maintain that forever, and nor do they necessarily need to. But we have to look at, okay, what's the level of functionality that is going to be most ideal or most optimal for me trying to age well? And can I continue to progress towards that? I have no worries about, maintaining strength as I get older. Am I going to, push my Zercher squat over 400 pounds? Probably not at this point. But, I'm kind of more, if I can maintain or if I can gain a little bit more over the time. And sometimes as we age, and we're doing a lot and we're gaining a lot, sometimes maintenance is gains as we get older. I've repeatedly complained about the normative data for like the bench press, where if I'm in my 20s and I bench my body weight, I'm in average condition. And if I'm now in my 60s and I can bench my body weight, I'm like superhuman. That to me is ridiculous, but it just shows that the more we can maintain, the more we are separating ourselves from others in our age groups. And, the more we're aging well.
So how can periodization support long-term motivation and prevent burnout or exercise fatigue?
Well, hopefully we've been kind of touching on this all along, is that both psychologically and physiologically, if we're periodizing, it's a lot easier to be motivated because you're going to continue to see gains. You're not getting bored by doing the same thing over and over and over again. I mean, think about, intellectual wellness. If I read the same book every day, year after year, it gets kind of boring after a while, right? You know what's coming next. You're not learning from it. And so the same thing with exercise. If we keep doing the same thing over and over again, we're going to get burned out because we're just bored with it. Or our bodies aren't able to really respond or adapt to it. And, I don't think we have to worry about fatigue as much in those situations. It's just boredom. And periodization is going to allow for our body systems to adapt more holistically over time than if we just keep doing the same thing over and over again. We're getting that greater breadth of conditioning. We're running the spectrum from cardiorespiratory endurance all the way up to pure strength and everything in between when we're doing periodization. Let's pause briefly to acknowledge an affiliate partner that helps support the Aging Well podcast. We're not sponsored and we don't accept paid placements. But when you use our affiliate links, it helps us continue creating this show. One product I've personally vetted and believe in is Nemo, a simple but thoughtful solution designed to support knee comfort and mobility during daily activities. I appreciate its practical design, ease of use, and focus on helping people stay active as they age. It's a product I'm comfortable recommending because it aligns with our philosophy of supporting movement, function, and independence. If you'd like to support the podcast and learn more about Nemo, you'll find a link in the show notes.
What are some common misconceptions about periodization that might make people think it's too complex or it's just unnecessary for them?
I think they think that you essentially need to have like a National Strength and Conditioning Association certification in order to be able to adequately do periodization. And the reality is there's no perfect periodization plan. I mean, the more experienced you are with it, the better. And it is highly individualized. It's very sports specific, but it's also goal specific. So I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that people just think that it's beyond them to do, or it's going to take too much energy to be able to manage it. And it's not really, you don't even need a complex exercise program in order to do a reasonable amount of periodization. You could do that same basic 5 exercises week to week and not really vary the exercise themselves, but by just simply cycling the number of repetitions or the number of sets that you're doing, changing the weight and doing, maybe a little bit different tempo from time to time, you're going to see greater growth. And so it's really just identifying, okay, here's the period of time I'm looking at. I'm going to do this for this period of time, this for this period of time, this for this period of time. And, it can be as simple as block type training where you're just going to, okay, 3 months, I'm going to work on hypertrophy. So I'm going to do, a little bit more volume, not as much in high weight. Then I'm going to build towards strength. And so I'm going to do, heavier weights, fewer sets and fewer repetitions. And then I'm going to do a period of time where I'm just going to work on tempo to kind of work on my explosiveness and my power. And you're doing the same exercises regularly. It's simple. And I think the biggest misconception people have is that it is complex. And in regards to that it's unnecessary, it's like, okay, go to the gym, do the same thing for year after year and see where you are in 10 years compared to your peer who has done a much more structured periodization plan. I guarantee you're going to be kind of stagnant, be where you were for those years, because you're not going to be able to progress enough to really see great gains in hypertrophy, strength, power, and those types of areas. And the same thing goes for cardiovascular. If you're not periodizing, you just go out and do the same run or walk every day, year after year, you're not going to see gains. And you're actually probably going to start to see a decline in fitness level because you're losing the capacity to do more.
You kind of did a 2-for-1 question right there. You answered that question and you answered my next question. I'm just going to ask it again just so you can give us a quick summary. But how can periodization be simplified and practically applied for older adults who aren't competitive athletes?
Okay, I don't even think it has to be that complicated for athletes either. I mean, I think it's just, pick a parameter you want to work on, do that for a period of time, and then shift to something else. Now, in doing that, I'm not as much a fan of more block type of periodization, because I think if I do a 3-month period of hypertrophy, and by the time I get to power, if I'm working with athletes doing the same thing, you build a lot of size up, and then you go into your strength cycle, you're going to lose some of the hypertrophy working on just strength. And then you go into power, you lose some of the strength and the hypertrophy. And so the whole idea to me is to take that force velocity relationship and just keep sliding it to the right, where we're stronger, faster velocities, and we're just all out stronger across the board. And we just progress everything rather than seeing it kind of, we gain strength, lose velocity or lose power, gain power, we lose strength, and just keep kind of ratcheting things along. And I know it's a little bit hard to visualize without any kind of graphics or anything, but I think a more undulating approach allows us to, maybe over the course of the week, I do 6 workouts a week. I'm doing muscle endurance on Sunday, Monday. Tuesday, Wednesday, I'm doing hypertrophy. And then Thursday, Friday, I'm doing strength, where I'm doing, 12 to 15 repetitions, 10 to 12 repetitions, 5 to 8 repetitions. And that is going to allow me to continue to cycle through. And that's extremely simple. And then just every 4 weeks or so, you do a little deload, change up your exercises a little bit, and go through it again. That's periodization, and it's not overly complex. It's probably not sport specific enough as you might with, a bigger, annual seasonal training program, but it's still periodization. It's still a systematic variability of the exercise that's got a intention in place.
This next question, I know you kind of touched on it this whole episode, but can periodization be applied beyond strength training? For example, cardiovascular training, mobility work, or even lifestyle stress?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's across the board. any area, and you can take the entire SPIES model
Right.
and look at that from a periodization standpoint, and I think that's a perfect example of how periodization is an aging well concept. I if you look at somebody, their spiritual, physical, intellectual, emotional, and social development, maybe you're in a period of life where you're having to put a little extra effort into fixing your physiological health, well-being. Maybe you have some health issues, and you're maybe not focused as much on the spiritual. Maybe you're not journaling quite as much because maybe you're working out more to train for a marathon, whatever it could be. Intellectual. You think of like college students, they're putting all their energy into academics. They may not be as focused on getting to the gym as much. They're maybe not having as much social interaction because they got to study more. And so we go through these periods of time where, okay, we're going to focus on these things, but then we have to kind of back off a little bit, maybe put some other focus in these other areas for a period of time, and then put some more focus in other areas. And so no matter what you're doing, if we stick to the physiological point, cardiovascular training, you're not always just going to go out and run or only sprint. You need to do a little bit of everything in order to improve your overall performance. Mobility work, you don't need to be doing mobility or flexibility exercises for areas that you're already flexible in. So we want to just focus on the areas that we have a bit more of a detriment on. And if I'm really mobile, I don't need to be spending much time doing any kind of stretching. I can be focused now on doing more strength training, cardiovascular training,
Fair.
or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
So periodization applies to our entire aging well model.
Well, how does periodization align with your broader philosophy of aging well and training for function, resilience, and purpose?
I think I just kind of answered
You
that
sure
already.
did. I know. You've been
Uh,
answering almost like the next questions as I ask one, you answered my next one. It's like you're just
well, I mean, periodization is aging well. I mean, it's being able to train for a specific purpose with intention and with a systematic approach. And if we have a goal mindset or a growth mindset, we know what we want to do or where we want to go, then how do we get there in the most effective way? And it's planning ahead. It's just simply periodization is planning. And it's not anything overly complicated. It's just having a mindset of having a goal and planning how the heck you're going to get there.
all right, Dr. Armstrong. So, if someone listening wanted to take just one step towards more intentional training after this episode, what mindset shift should they start with?
Well, I think the main mindset shift. That's a hard thing to say. Is going to be just training with intention. I mean, the fact that you've decided to take a step toward training with intention is a mindset shift. Rather than just going to the gym willy-nilly, just look at, okay, what do I want to start with? Do I want to start with my cardiovascular fitness, my strength, my muscle endurance, flexibility? We'll focus on body composition, or do I want to go into more of the neuromotor skill-related components of fitness? What do I want to start with? How am I going to, what's my goal? How am I going to get there? And then what am I going to do once I hit that goal? So, anyone listening who just wants to be more intentional with their training, probably the best advice I would give is go out, buy a composition notebook or some kind of notebook, a good pen, and take it with you to the gym or wherever you do your training. Write down what you're training day after day and look at that over time. Okay, this is week 1. This is going to go to week 4. What am I going to do at week 5? And just plan, this is what I want to do. Maybe even map out, okay, these are my goals over the course of the year. I'm going to take these weeks to do this, these weeks to do that, and have it mapped out. Doesn't have to be overly detailed, but just enough to kind of plan things out so that you know, okay, this is what I got to do for this period of time. This is what I got to do the next period of time. And just write it down, plan it, and do it. And the biggest thing is do it. If you're more intentional about your training, you want to be more intentional, then take the step and be intentional.
So I guess on that note, periodization doesn't have to be overcomplicated. It just has to be training with a purpose. Have that main goal, that whatever it is that you want to do, if you have an area of strength or cardiovascular or even flexibility, whatever it is that you want to improve on, train with a purpose in order to get better. And as you're training to get better, as you're focusing on your goals, as you're adding more to your daily routine to focus on that training, focus on recovery, not only are you training to improve, but you're also training to age well.
Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Aging Well podcast. Please like, subscribe, or follow, and share this episode with a friend. And be sure to visit the affiliate links in the description below. Thank you for listening, and until next time, keep aging well.